flight attendant broke a black boy's jaw, didn't realize a federal judge was sitting nearby. "Shut your mouth and learn some respect, boy." The words sliced through Flight 847's cabin like a blade sharp enough to kill conversations mid-sentence. Derek Hoffman, a stocky flight attendant whose graying temples framed permanently hostile eyes, towered over 10-year-old Jalen Brooks with the kind of raw contempt that made passengers instinctively reach for their phones. The recycled air suddenly felt thick with tension. Jalen clutched the in-flight magazine where "Apple Juice, $300" was printed in bold letters, his small fingers trembling as Derek's shadow fell across his seat. The silver unaccompanied minor tag around his neck caught the harsh overhead lighting. I said please, sir," Jalen whispered, his voice barely audible. "I was trying to be polite." Derek's face turned red, veins bulging. "Don't you dare talk back to me. Kids like you think you can waltz onto my plane and run your mouth." In Seat 1A, Judge Alexander Rivera set down his legal brief, every instinct screaming danger. At 45, he'd seen enough courtroom violence to recognize the moment before someone snapped. What Derek Hoffman couldn't know, what nobody on this aircraft knew, was that Rivera wasn't just a federal judge. Through his father's trust fund, he owned 12% of Skyreach Airlines stock, making him the company's largest individual shareholder. Rivera pulled out his phone not to record, but to take notes. Timestamps, exact quotes. If this escalated, he wanted every detail documented. Derek stepped closer, invading Jalen's space. "We don't serve juice to smart-mouthed kids who can't follow instructions. Maybe your daddy never taught you how to respect your betters." The word "betters" landed like a slap. Several passengers gasped. A woman in 8D started recording. Emma Richardson in 10B opened her Instagram Live, her marketing instincts, recognizing this was about to explode. 6 hours earlier, Jalen Brooks had bounced out of bed in his father's Seattle apartment, excited about his first solo flight. At 10, he was mature for his age, the kind of kid who read books about space and helped neighbors with groceries. His father, Devon, a 38-year-old former Army intelligence officer turned corporate security consultant, had drilled him on airport procedures. "Son, treat everyone with respect," Devon had said, adjusting Jalen's Seahawks t-shirt at the gate. "But never let anyone steal your dignity. Big difference between being polite and being a doormat." Devon's military background had taught him to prepare for contingencies, but he couldn't have imagined this scenario. His transition from Army intelligence to corporate security consulting, specializing in identifying institutional vulnerabilities, had given him the perfect skill set for what was about to unfold. Derek Hoffman's story was darker than his aggressive exterior suggested. Growing up dirt poor in Montana, he'd been the target of classmates who mocked his second-hand clothes and teachers who saw no potential in trailer trash. The military rejected him for a minor heart condition. College was financially impossible. Each rejection had built layers of resentment that crystallized around a simple belief the world owed him respect, and he'd take it from those too weak to fight back. Over 15 years at Skyreach, Derek had learned which passengers he could target without consequences. Unaccompanied minors, elderly travelers, anyone who wouldn't or couldn't fight back effectively. His personnel file contained a pattern of buried complaints. The first involved spilling soda accidentally on a Hispanic teenager's laptop after the boy asked for extra napkins. The family's complaint vanished after a $500 voucher and NDA. The second incident involved refusing to help an elderly black woman lift her carry-on, telling her to ask someone who looks like family. HR dismissed it as miscommunication. The third complaint, parents of an autistic child claiming Derek mocked their son's speech, was buried entirely by Supervisor Robert Chen, who decided Derek's version was more credible. Each buried complaint had emboldened Derek further. He'd become expert at targeting vulnerable passengers while avoiding obvious evidence. Judge Alexander Rivera carried his own motivation. The previous year, his 14-year-old son Miguel had been racially profiled at a shopping mall. Security guards followed the boy for an hour, assuming criminality based on appearance. When Miguel politely asked why one guard grabbed his arm hard enough to leave bruises. The incident haunted Rivera. Not just what happened, but what could have happened if Miguel had been alone, if there had been no witnesses, if the guard had lost complete control. Rivera's hidden connection to Skyreach Airlines added complexity. His late father's trust fund held 12% of the airline's stock, making Rivera the largest individual shareholder. He'd maintained judicial neutrality by never hearing aviation cases involving Skyreach, but this situation was about to change everything. Captain Sarah Mitchell, 40, sat in the cockpit reviewing flight plans, while Derek's voice echoed from the cabin. She'd worked her way up by avoiding conflict and maintaining status quo. She'd heard Derek's aggressive tone before, but classified it as maintaining discipline, rather than confronting uncomfortable truths about discrimination. Sarah's own complicity ran deeper than passive acceptance. 3 times in the past year, she'd received passenger complaints about Derek. Each time she'd filed reports supporting Derek's version of events, helping bury accusations of discriminatory behavior. The paperwork was easier when she blamed difficult passengers, rather than confronting discrimination among her crew. Rosa Martinez, 28, worked the aft galley with growing anxiety as Derek's voice got louder. In 2 years at Skyreach, she'd witnessed Derek target minority passengers repeatedly. Her family had emigrated from El Salvador when she was 12. She understood exactly what Derek's tone meant, but speaking up felt impossible. She needed this job to pay her mother's mounting medical bills after her diabetes diagnosis required expensive insulin treatments. Robert Chen had made clear that questioning Derek's authority resulted in termination. Rosa had seen it happen to other flight attendants who'd tried to intervene. Emma Richardson, 32, scrolled through her phone in 10B when Derek's hostile tone caught her attention. As a social media manager for a Portland tech startup, she recognized volatile situations that could go viral. Her Instagram account had 200 followers, modest but engaged. Something about Derek's aggressive posture triggered her professional instincts. She opened her livestream app. Within minutes of starting her stream, viewers began joining. Comments flooded in as people recognized what they were witnessing: an adult in authority terrorizing a child. The confrontation exploded when Jalen, desperately trying to prove his innocence, pulled out the in-flight menu. His small fingers pointed to the beverage section with the desperate hope of a child trying to prove he wasn't lying. "Look, sir, apple juice is right here on the menu," Jalen said softly, holding up the laminated card with trembling hands. Derek's reaction was volcanic. "Don't you dare tell me how to do my job." His voice boomed across the cabin. Heads turned throughout first class and premium economy. "You think you can lecture me about my aircraft?" The sound of Derek's rage, raw and unfiltered, sent shockwaves through the confined space. Passengers reached for call buttons. Others began discreet recordings. Normal flight sounds died as everyone focused on the confrontation. Emma Richardson's Instagram Live jumped to over 400 viewers. Her notification bar was exploding with comments. "Someone help that kid. This is child abuse. Call the pilot now. I'm screen recording this. Everyone share this now. This is going viral." Judge Rivera set his papers aside, completely every legal instinct activated. Derek's body language showed textbook escalation patterns he'd observed in hundreds of violent defendants: clenched fists, forward lean facial flushing, indicating dangerous adrenaline surge. Rivera had seen this exact progression in criminals seconds before they committed acts of violence. Rosa Martinez appeared from the galley, her face pale as she saw Derek's aggressive stance and the phones recording everything. This was exactly what she'd feared would eventually happen. Derek's hatred finally exploding in public where it couldn't be hidden or explained away. "Derek," she said carefully, like someone approaching a wild animal. "Maybe I could help with the beverage service." "Stay the hell out of this, Rosa," Derek snapped without looking at her. This boy needs to learn his place." The phrase, "learn his place," hit passengers like a physical blow. Several gasped audibly. Judge Rivera made careful notes of the exact wording, understanding its legal significance as evidence of discriminatory intent. Derek stepped closer to Jalen, his coffee breath and sweat smell overwhelming the child. "Let me explain something, boy. On this aircraft, I'm God. Not your daddy, not your mama, not whoever spoiled you into thinking you're special. Me." Jalen pressed back into his seat, tears threatening, but not falling. "I understand, sir. I just wanted some juice." "Forget the damn menu." Derek's explosion made Jalen flinch violently. Emma's livestream hit 1-800 viewers. Screenshots were already spreading across Twitter with the hashtag #FlightAbuse beginning to trend. Her follower count was jumping by hundreds every minute as the video was shared across platforms. Major news outlets' social media accounts were starting to repost clips. Judge Rivera watched Derek's hands trembling with barely controlled violence. In 30 years of criminal law, he'd learned to recognize the exact moment before someone crossed the line from verbal abuse to physical violence. Derek was seconds away from that line. This moment had been building for years, enabled by corporate culture that valued employee retention over passenger safety and profits over human dignity. Derek's transformation from victim to predator had been gradual but thorough. Each childhood humiliation had built resentment that crystallized into a simple worldview. Respect was a zero-sum game. If confident minority passengers, especially children who spoke up for themselves, got respect, that meant less for him. But Derek's hatred wasn't purely rational or even purely racial. Sometimes late at night in his studio apartment, he'd remember being 10 years old himself, hungry, wearing clothes that smelled like cigarettes, watching other kids get things he could never have. In those moments, he almost understood that his rage at Jalen was really rage at a world that had never given him what he'd needed as a child. Almost. But by morning, the brief flicker of self-awareness would be buried again under layers of justification and resentment that had hardened over decades. His first Skyreach incident had been almost accidental, spilling soda on that Hispanic teenager who'd asked for napkins. But when the complaint disappeared with just a voucher payment, Derek learned a valuable lesson: the system would protect him as long as he didn't leave obvious evidence or target passengers with obvious power. Each subsequent incident had been more calculated. Derek had studied which passengers complained effectively and which ones could be safely targeted. Unaccompanied minors were perfect victims. No adult advocates present, often too intimidated to report, easily dismissed if they did complain. Judge Rivera's backstory ran parallel to Derek's, but in the opposite direction. The previous year's incident with his son Miguel had reinforced his commitment to civil rights law, but it had also shown him how quickly authority figures could abuse power when they thought no one was watching or capable of holding them accountable. What made Rivera's presence significant was his hidden connection to Skyreach. His father's trust fund made him the airline's largest individual shareholder, though he'd never disclosed this to maintain judicial neutrality. The irony wasn't lost on him. Derek was about to commit a federal crime in front of someone who could hold the entire company financially and legally accountable. For Jalen, this was his first encounter with adult hatred directed at him personally. Devon had prepared him for many challenges but couldn't shield him from this reality: that some adults would hate him simply for being black in spaces they felt he didn't belong. Devon's military intelligence background had taught him to analyze patterns and predict institutional failures. Those skills would prove crucial in the coming battle, though he didn't know it yet. Derek's violence erupted when Jalen made one final attempt at peaceful resolution that somehow triggered Derek's deepest rage. "Sir, I don't want any trouble. Could I maybe just have water instead?" The polite question, delivered with heartbreaking dignity, seemed to detonate the last restraint in Derek's brain. 15 years of buried resentment found its target in a 10-year-old child who represented everything Derek felt the world had denied him. Kids like you need to be taught lessons the hard way. Derek raised his fist, his knuckles white with rage. Judge Rivera started to rise, but Derek's violence exploded faster than anyone could prevent. The punch landed with sickening force, Derek's knuckles connecting with Jalen's jaw like a hammer striking bone. The sound echoed through the cabin crack, wet splatter, metallic clink of the boy's ID tag hitting the tray table. Jalen's head snapped sideways with violent force, his small body crumpling against the window. Blood immediately began flowing from his mouth, soaking into his Seahawks t-shirt and spreading crimson stains. The cabin fell into shocked silence. Then chaos erupted. Emma Richardson's live stream captured everything in brutal, high-definition detail. Her viewer count exploded to over 6,000 as the footage spread across social media faster than platform algorithms could track. Comments became a waterfall of horror and rage. "Call 911 now. That's a child. Arrest this monster. Everyone record this. Viral this now. Share everywhere." Jalen couldn't scream. The punch had dislocated his jaw and fractured it in multiple places. Only a broken whimper escaped as blood pooled in his lap, staining his clothes and the seat cushion. Rosa Martinez rushed forward, her hands shaking as she grabbed napkins from the galley. The sight of blood flowing from a child's mouth triggered her own memories of violence in El Salvador, but her flight attendant training kicked in as she tried to stem the bleeding with whatever materials she could find. Judge Rivera stood with cold, controlled fury. "Everyone stay calm. We need medical assistance immediately." Derek stood over Jalen's broken form, breathing heavily, his knuckles split and bloody. Instead of remorse, his face showed satisfaction, like someone who'd finally delivered a lesson that had been long overdue. He got what he deserved. Derek panted, looking around for approval from other passengers. Disrespectful little punk needed to learn some manners. Shut up. Rivera's voice cut through Derek's justification like ice water. You just committed a federal crime in front of 40 witnesses. Derek's satisfaction flickered as he registered Rivera's tone of absolute authority. Who the hell are you? Rivera pulled out his federal badge, the gold shield catching the cabin lights. Federal Judge Alexander Rivera, you're under arrest for assault of a minor. Derek's face went white as the implications hit him. You can't. I just did. An off-duty Denver police officer named Tom Bradley zip-tied Derek's hands while Rivera coordinated with flight crew for emergency landing and medical response. Emma's live stream hit 15,000 viewers. Hatch justice. For Jalen was trending nationally as the video spread faster than anyone could track. Her phone was buzzing with notifications from major news outlets offering exclusive interview deals. Captain Sarah Mitchell's voice crackled over the intercom, shaky and uncertain. Ladies and gentlemen, we're making an emergency landing in St. Louis. Medical personnel will meet us at the gate. Jalen tried to speak, but only bloody bubbles emerged from his mouth. His jaw hung unnaturally clearly fractured in multiple places. I'm so sorry, Rosa whispered to him, tears streaming down her face. I should have stopped him earlier. I knew this would happen. Rivera knelt beside Jalen, his judicial composure cracking as he saw the extent of the child's injuries. What's your name, son? Jalen Brooks, the boy whispered through broken teeth and swollen lips. Jalen, I'm Judge Rivera. Your dad's going to be so proud of how brave you're being right now. As Flight 847 began its emergency descent toward St. Louis, Derek realized his world had just ended. But his violence had also ignited something bigger, a national conversation about discrimination, institutional failure, and the protection of vulnerable travelers that would reshape American aviation forever. The 37 minutes remaining until landing would feel like hours for everyone involved, but they would mark the beginning of one of the most significant civil rights cases in aviation history. The emergency response at Lambert St. Louis Airport was swift and coordinated. FBI agent Patricia Williams had been monitoring Emma Richardson's live stream from the St. Louis field office, watching Derek's assault in real time alongside thousands of other viewers across the country. By the time Flight 847 touched down, federal agents, paramedics, local police, and a rapidly growing crowd of media were positioned at Gate C-12. Emma's video had exploded across social media with unprecedented velocity. In the 45 minutes since Derek's assault, the footage had been viewed over 800,000 times. Major news networks were already running the clip on breaking news broadcasts, and celebrities were retweeting it with outraged commentary that amplified its reach exponentially. "Holy shit," Emma whispered to herself, watching her notifications blow up. Her follower count had jumped from 5,200 to over 73,000 in under an hour. News producers were calling her phone non-stop, offering interviews and exclusive deals worth more money than she made in a year. The hashtag #HashJusticeForJalen was trending worldwide with over 100,000 tweets in the first hour alone. #FlightAbuse and #Skyreach Accountability were also trending as people shared screenshots, reaction videos, and personal stories of airline discrimination. Jalen's condition had worsened during the emergency descent. Blood continued seeping through Rosa's improvised bandages, and the child's breathing had become more labored. His face was swollen beyond recognition, jaw clearly broken in multiple places, and there were concerns about potential brain injury from the impact. "Stay with me, buddy," Judge Rivera whispered, maintaining his protective position beside the injured boy. "Your dad's gonna want to hear how brave you were today." Captain Sarah Mitchell emerged from the cockpit for the first time since takeoff, her face draining of color when she saw the blood-soaked seat and the child on an emergency stretcher. In 15 years of commercial aviation, she'd never encountered anything approaching this level of violence. "Derek, Jesus Christ, what have you done?" She whispered, her voice breaking as she realized her career was probably over. Derek, hands still zip-tied behind his back, looked up desperately at his captain. "Sarah, you know how passengers can get these days. The kid was mouthy, wouldn't listen to authority. I had to maintain discipline. You shattered a child's jaw." Rivera's voice silenced Derek's excuses. "There's no explanation that makes this anything other than criminal assault motivated by racial hatred." FBI agent Williams boarded with professional efficiency, followed by a team of federal investigators who had been mobilized within minutes of the live stream going viral. "Judge Rivera, I'm Agent Williams, FBI. We monitored the incident through social media channels." Rivera stood carefully, not wanting to disturb the paramedics working on Jalen. "Agent Williams, I witnessed the entire assault. Derek Hoffman attacked this child without provocation, using language that clearly indicated racial animus and discriminatory intent." Paramedic Maria Santos worked with practiced expertise to stabilize Jalen for transport. "Judge, we need to get him to Children's Hospital immediately. Multiple mandible fractures, possible traumatic brain injury from the impact, significant blood loss." As the stretcher was prepared, Jalen's eyes searched frantically through the swelling. Where's my dad?" he whispered through his wired jaw. Rivera leaned close. "I called him personally. He's flying in from Seattle right now and will be here soon." Emma Richardson had stopped live streaming but was providing her footage directly to federal investigators. The video had now been viewed over 1.2 million times across platforms, with #JusticeForJalen trending in over 12 countries. "Ms. Richardson, this footage is crucial evidence in a federal criminal case," Agent Williams told Emma. "Would you be willing to testify about what you witnessed?" Emma nodded firmly, still stunned by the viral explosion that was reshaping her life in real time. That child did absolutely nothing wrong. Derek was aggressive and hostile from the very first word. Everyone saw it happen. Her phone buzzed with calls from CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and major documentary producers. The offers were overwhelming. Exclusive interviews, book deals, documentary contracts. Emma realized her accidental citizen journalism had just changed her life forever. Rosa Martinez approached Agent Williams, nervously aware that phones were still recording everything around the incident. "Agent Williams, I need to tell you something important. This isn't Derek's first incident like this." Rivera's attention sharpened. "What do you mean, Ms. Martinez?" Rosa's hands trembled as she spoke, knowing her career was probably over but unable to stay silent any longer. "I've worked with Derek for 2 years. I've seen him target minority passengers before. Verbal abuse, intimidation, harassment. But I was too scared to report it officially. I need this job to pay my mom's medical bills." Agent Williams motioned Detective Morrison over to take Rosa's statement while paramedics rushed Jalen toward the ambulance. Media crews were already broadcasting live from outside the aircraft, with reporters describing the most shocking airline violence caught on video. As the stretcher passed through the jet bridge, Jalen's small voice carried back to the cabin. "Judge Rivera, tell my dad I tried to be brave like he taught me." Rivera felt his judicial composure crack completely. "He's gonna be so proud, son. So proud." Outside, Emma Richardson found herself surrounded by reporters shoving microphones in her face. Camera crews jostling for position. "Emma, how does it feel to have documented what might be the most important airline discrimination case in American history?" While Jalen underwent emergency surgery at St. Louis Children's Hospital Rivera, found himself in an unprecedented ethical position that would reshape the entire case. His dual role as witness and Skyreach's largest shareholder created legal complexities he'd never faced in 23 years on the federal bench. Agent Williams requested Rivera's assistance in understanding Skyreach's corporate structure and potential institutional failures. "Judge Rivera, your expertise in civil rights law could help us identify patterns of discrimination that enabled this assault." Rivera's response was carefully measured, knowing that his next words would have far-reaching consequences. "Agent Williams, I need to make a full disclosure about my financial relationship to Skyreach Airlines. Through my father's family trust, I hold approximately 12% of the company's stock, making me their largest individual shareholder." Agent Williams processed this information quickly, understanding the implications immediately. "That could complicate your role as a witness, but it also gives us unique leverage." "Exactly. It provides me with legal access to internal communications, board decisions, and corporate policies that enabled Derek's behavior. I've maintained judicial neutrality by recusing myself from all Skyreach-related cases, but this situation changes everything." Rivera pulled out his phone and dialed a number few people possessed, the direct emergency line to Skyreach's board chairman. "William Harper, it's Alexander Rivera. We need an emergency board meeting right now. Derek Hoffman just committed a federal crime in front of me, and I want immediate answers about the institutional failures that enabled it." Board Chairman Harper's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Alexander, thank God you called. The board's in complete crisis mode. Our stock is crashing in after-hours trading. This could destroy the entire company." "William, I was on that plane. I watched Derek assault a child with my own eyes. He didn't act in isolation. He was enabled by management that systematically buried previous complaints. I want full access to his personnel records, all discrimination files, every corporate communication about passenger safety protocols." Harper's silence stretched several seconds as he calculated the implications. "As our largest shareholder, you have that legal right. But if this connection becomes public knowledge—" "It's already public knowledge, William. Over 1 million people watched that child get beaten on livestream. The question isn't whether this gets exposed. It's whether Skyreach helps uncover the truth or becomes complicit in covering up institutional discrimination." Rivera's position was unprecedented in corporate America. A federal judge with legal authority to demand accountability and the ownership stake to financially enforce it. Derek had unknowingly attacked a child in front of someone who possessed moral, legal, and financial power over his employer, while federal agents interviewed witnesses and collected evidence. Emma Richardson sat in the airport terminal watching her phone screen with growing amazement and dawning horror. Her Instagram live video of Derek's assault was spreading across social media like wildfire, reshaping her entire existence in real time. "This is insane," she whispered, watching the view count climb past 2.5 million. Her follower count had exploded to over 250,000. Major news networks were offering her exclusive interview deals worth six figures. Documentary producers were pitching projects, and literary agents were calling about book deals. But with the viral fame came an avalanche of hatred from Derek's supporters, airline employee groups, and internet trolls who were flooding her accounts with threats and accusations. "You destroyed a man's life for clicks and followers," read one message. "You should have minded your own business instead of ruining someone's career," said another. "Derek was just doing his job, maintaining discipline. You made this about race when it wasn't. Hope you can sleep at night knowing you destroyed a working man's livelihood." Emma was also receiving thousands of messages of support from people who'd experienced similar treatment. A black businessman from Chicago messaged, "Thank you for recording this. I was verbally abused by a United flight attendant last year but had no proof. Your video shows the world what really happens to us up there." Her phone rang again, this time Anderson Cooper's producer offering a primetime CNN exclusive. Emma realized she was at a crossroads that would define the rest of her life. She could cash in on the viral fame and make serious money from interviews and media deals, or she could use the platform responsibly to advocate for real change. She declined the immediate TV offers and instead posted a follow-up video to her social media accounts. "I didn't record Derek Hoffman's assault of Jalen Brooks for views, followers, or fame. I recorded it because I saw something wrong happening and felt a responsibility to document it. Now that this video has been seen by millions, I want to use this platform to make sure something like this never happens again to any child." The follow-up video went viral too, cementing Emma's transformation from accidental citizen journalist to purposeful advocate. Within 24 hours, she would launch a nonprofit called Witness for Justice, focused on training citizen journalists to document discrimination and abuse. 6 hours after the assault, Devon Brooks burst through St. Louis Children's Hospital emergency doors like a man at war with time itself. The former Army intelligence officer had called in every favor and contact to get on the first available military transport flight, his mind systematically working through worst-case scenarios during the entire journey. Devon's first sight of his son almost brought the trained soldier to his knees. Jalen lay unconscious, connected to multiple machines, his face swollen beyond recognition, jaw wired shut from emergency reconstructive surgery. "Mr. Brooks." Judge Rivera approached from the family waiting area, his usually pristine appearance disheveled from hours of worry and coordination with investigators. "You're the judge who protected my son." Devon's voice cracked with emotion and exhaustion. "How bad is it? Give me the full sit rep." As they walked toward the pediatric ICU, Rivera briefed Devon with systematic precision that matched the father's military background. His legal training showed in his methodical fact recounting, but Devon's intelligence experience let him hear implications and patterns beyond the surface details. "This Derek Hoffman," Devon said, his voice taking on the dangerous edge of a soldier identifying a threat. "What's his operational history?" "That's where this situation becomes strategically complex," Rivera replied, recognizing Devon's military communication style. According to preliminary FBI interviews and testimony from flight attendant Rosa Martinez, Derek has a documented pattern of targeting minority passengers. More significantly, these incidents appear to have been deliberately covered up by airline management through systematic protocols. Devon stopped walking, his military instincts immediately recognizing familiar patterns from intelligence work. How were they covered up? What's the standard operating procedure? NDAs, financial settlements, buried complaint documentation. The classic corporate playbook for protecting problematic assets while neutralizing opposition. They reached the ICU where Dr. Emily Rodriguez waited with medical updates. Mr. Brooks Jalen's condition has stabilized. The surgery was successful, but he has multiple mandible fractures requiring reconstructive procedures. Full recovery will take months, possibly requiring additional surgical interventions. When Devon saw his injured son, tears streamed down the face of the trained soldier. Jalen's eyes opened and met his father's, immediately filling with tears of relief and pain that cut through Devon's military composure. "Dad," Jalen whispered through his wired jaw. "I was polite. I said please and thank you just like you taught me. Did I do something wrong?" Devon took his son's hand gently, his military training helping him maintain calm despite his internal rage. "Negative, buddy. You executed your mission perfectly. This isn't your fault. Not any part of it." Rivera watched from the doorway as father and son reconnected, his own resolve crystallizing into something harder than steel. This wasn't just about individual justice anymore. "Mr. Brooks," Rivera said when Devon stepped outside, "I need to brief you about my connection to this airline and what it means for our operational capabilities." Rivera explained his shareholding position and the unique leverage it provided. Devon's intelligence background immediately grasped the strategic implications. "You're telling me the target who attacked my son doesn't know he committed a federal crime in front of the company's actual owner? Derek has no operational awareness of that fact. But more importantly, I have access to board communications, internal documents, executive decision-making processes. We can expose not just individual criminal behavior, but the institutional culture that enabled and protected it." Devon studied Rivera's face with the analytical skills of a trained intelligence officer, seeing steel beneath the judicial calm. "Judge Rivera, you're proposing we execute a full-spectrum takedown of the entire system that protected Derek Hoffman." "Roger that, Mr. Brooks. We use every asset at our disposal, legal, financial, moral authority, to ensure this never happens to another child. Are you operational?" Devon's smile was cold and determined, the expression of a soldier who'd found his next mission. "Copy that, Your Honor. Let's burn down their whole damn system." While Jalen fought for his life in surgery, Skyreach's corporate headquarters had transformed into a crisis command center that resembled a war room during a catastrophic defeat. CEO Jonathan Pierce paced his executive conference room like a caged animal watching social media analytics that looked like a spreading epidemic of corporate destruction. "Status report. How bad is our exposure?" Pierce demanded of Communications Director Linda Walsh. Walsh's hands shook as she read from multiple tablets displaying real-time data. The hashtag justice. For Jalen has been used over 3.2 million times in 18 hours. Emma Richardson's livestream footage has been viewed over 12 million times across all platforms. Every major news outlet in America and Europe is leading with this story. We're facing boycott threats from civil rights organizations in 15 countries. Pierce's phone was ringing nonstop with calls from board members, institutional investors, and crisis management firms. The company's stock had dropped 18% in after-hours trading, wiping out billions in market capitalization. Legal counsel Maria Santos, whose repeated warnings about Derek had been consistently ignored by management, spoke with barely controlled fury that years of professional frustration had finally unleashed. "Jonathan, I warned you about Derek Hoffman 22 months ago. I have documented emails recommending his immediate termination that you and the board overruled for operational continuity reasons." Pierce's face went pale as he realized the legal implications. "Maria, those communications are attorney-client privileged. Not when they relate to criminal conspiracy to violate federal civil rights. The FBI has already served federal warrants for all documents related to Derek's employment history, complaint management, and executive decision-making processes." Pierce's phone buzzed urgently with the call he'd been dreading. Board Chairman Harper's voice was tight with panic that bordered on hysteria. "Jonathan, we have a catastrophic situation beyond Derek's assault. Alexander Rivera was on that flight." "Who the hell is Alexander Rivera?" "Federal Judge Alexander Rivera, civil rights specialist with 23 years on the bench. Also our largest individual shareholder through his family trust fund." Pierce felt the world collapse beneath him. "Our biggest investor witnessed the assault. He witnessed it, documented it, arrested Derek personally, and he's furious about institutional failures. Emergency board meeting in 2 hours. Your job and possibly your freedom are on the line." VP of Human Resources, Robert Chen, sat silently at the conference table, knowing his career and possibly his liberty were finished. For 3 years, he'd protected Derek through systematically buried complaints, manipulated settlement agreements, and dismissive responses to discrimination allegations. Every decision had been documented. Every cover-up had left digital evidence. Pierce turned to Chen with desperate eyes. "Robert, what's our total exposure on Derek's previous incidents?" Chen shifted uncomfortably, realizing his next words could be used against him in criminal proceedings. "We've settled 11 complaints in 4 years, all with NDAs, all classified as miscommunication, cultural misunderstanding, or customer service issues." Maria Santos leaned forward aggressively, her legal training taking over. "Robert, did you just admit under oath to a systematic pattern of discrimination cover-ups in front of witnesses?" The room fell silent as everyone realized Chen had just confessed to potential criminal conspiracy in a federal civil rights case. But the real crisis was just beginning. Pierce's assistant burst through the conference room doors. "Sir, FBI agents are here with federal warrants for all of Derek's records, discrimination complaint files, and internal communications from the past 6 years. They also want to interview all senior management immediately under oath." Pierce looked around at his executive team, seeing his own terror reflected in their faces. But some board members weren't accepting defeat quietly. Director Michael Torres had already retained criminal defense counsel, claiming the company was being scapegoated for one employee's actions. Director Sarah Kim was threatening to fight any terminations through expensive litigation that could drag on for years. The corporate unity Rivera expected from his shareholding position wasn't materializing. Corporate transformation would be messier, more expensive, and more legally complex than anyone had anticipated. FBI agent Williams established her field command center at Lambert Airport, but the investigation immediately faced systematic obstacles that suggested coordinated resistance. Skyreach's legal team, led by a major corporate law firm, was fighting document requests through federal court. Union representatives were protecting Derek's procedural rights, and some board members were actively obstructing cooperation through legal challenges. Devon Brooks sat across from Agent Williams in the airport conference room, his intelligence background evident in his systematic approach to analyzing institutional resistance patterns. Judge Rivera occupied a chair beside him, both men recognizing this would be a prolonged battle against entrenched interests. "What we're discovering," Agent Williams explained, "goes far beyond Derek's individual actions. But Skyreach is implementing sophisticated obstruction tactics. They're claiming executive privilege on key communications, fighting our document requests through federal court, and their IT department is claiming routine data deletion, destroyed crucial evidence." Devon's military experience made him immediately suspicious of organized resistance patterns. How specifically are they obstructing the investigation? Multiple angles. Several key witnesses have suddenly become unavailable for interviews. Legal is filing emergency motions to limit our access to personnel records. They've hired a crisis management firm that's contacting Derek's previous victims, offering enhanced settlement money in exchange for stronger NDAs that would prevent cooperation. Rivera leaned forward, anger flashing in his eyes. "As their largest shareholder, I can override some of these legal objections, but it'll require time and aggressive legal maneuvering." A knock interrupted as Detective Morrison entered with Rosa Martinez, who looked genuinely terrified. Ms. Martinez has additional crucial information, but she's receiving serious threats from other employees who blame her for destroying Derek's life and career. Rosa sat down nervously, her phone buzzing with hateful messages that had escalated beyond mere criticism. I've been getting calls, texts, people following me home from work. Other flight attendants are saying I betrayed Derek, that I should have minded my own business instead of ruining a working man's life. Tell us about Derek's previous incidents, Agent Williams prompted, recording everything. Rosa took a shaky breath, knowing her testimony could trigger even more retaliation. 6 months ago, Derek refused bathroom access to a Hispanic family's diabetic child during a medical emergency. He said they were scamming their way into first-class privileges. The kid went into diabetic shock. We had to make an emergency landing in Phoenix. Devon's jaw clenched with military precision. What were the consequences for Derek? Robert Chen told him to be more culturally sensitive in communications. No formal discipline, no documentation in his personnel file. The family received $3,000 in flight vouchers and signed an NDA preventing public disclosure. Rivera made detailed notes for future legal proceedings. How was the incident officially classified? Medical miscommunication incident. Chen said the family misunderstood Derek's authority to manage bathroom access during medical situations. But Rosa had more disturbing institutional information. There's something else. Derek has active supporters among the crew. Some flight attendants think he was just maintaining necessary discipline. They're saying Jalen was probably disrespectful, and Derek reacted appropriately to passenger aggression. Agent Williams frowned, understanding the implications. Other employees are actively defending Derek's assault of a child. Not the assault specifically, but they're saying passengers, especially certain demographic groups, have gotten too entitled and need to be reminded about respecting crew authority through firm disciplinary action. Devon stood and walked to the window, fists clenched as he processed the institutional support for Derek's behavior. The problems ran deeper than individual corruption. They reflected cultural acceptance of discriminatory authority. Agent Williams received an urgent call from the FBI field office. After hanging up, she faced the group with mixed news that reflected the complexity of federal law enforcement. We have a significant breakthrough and a major setback. Carlos Mendez, former Skyreach HR coordinator, contacted our field office with documents proving systematic conspiracy. But Derek's union has hired a high-powered criminal defense team that's fighting our charges, claiming Derek felt physically threatened and acted in legitimate self-defense. Rivera's expression hardened with judicial anger. Self-defense against a 10-year-old child asking for apple juice. Their strategy is to argue that Jalen was verbally aggressive, that Derek reasonably feared for his physical safety, and that the punch was an instinctive reaction to perceived threat from an increasingly hostile passenger. Devon turned back from the window with the cold expression of a soldier who'd identified enemy tactics. Judge Rivera, how do we counter that kind of systematic legal manipulation? Rivera's smile was as cold as a judicial sentencing. We prepare for total war, and we make sure everyone involved understands the complete cost of enabling Derek Hoffman's pattern of violence. While the federal investigation built momentum, Captain Sarah Mitchell found herself facing consequences that would destroy everything she'd spent 15 years building in commercial aviation. Her role in enabling Derek's behavior was being scrutinized by federal investigators, airline management, the Federal Aviation Administration, and pilot licensing authorities. Sarah sat in her attorney's downtown office reviewing internal Skyreach communications that painted a damning picture of her systematic complicity in covering up discrimination. 3 separate passenger complaints about Derek's behavior had crossed her desk in the past 14 months. Each time she'd filed captain's reports that dismissed the complaints as passenger overreactions, cultural misunderstandings, or normal disciplinary interactions. Sarah, your reports consistently supported Derek's version of events over passenger complaints. Her attorney explained grimly, knowing his client's case was nearly hopeless. The FBI has emails where you explicitly recommended that management ignore discrimination complaints against Derek as typical passenger entitlement issues. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper as the full weight of her choices hit her. I thought he was just old school, that he maintained better cabin discipline than younger crew members. I didn't want to see what was really happening because it would have meant paperwork investigations, possible crew shortages. The FAA is reviewing your pilot's license for potential revocation. Federal investigators want extensive interviews about systematic discrimination enablement, and Skyreach is positioning you as a scapegoat to protect higher-level executives. Sarah realized her career was over, but worse, she understood that her willful blindness had contributed to a child being brutally assaulted. She'd worked 15 years to become a captain, only to lose everything because she'd chosen administrative convenience over moral courage. In a tearful interview with federal investigators, Sarah finally acknowledged the full scope of her complicity. I knew Derek had serious issues with certain categories of passengers. I told myself he was just maintaining necessary discipline, that passengers these days were too demanding and entitled. I didn't want to deal with the complications that would come from acknowledging systematic discrimination among my crew. Sarah's cooperation provided investigators with crucial insider perspective on Skyreach's culture of willful blindness, but it came too late to save her career reputation or legal standing. Her pilot's license was suspended pending federal investigation, and she submitted her resignation to Skyreach Airlines. The captain who'd once commanded respect in cockpits worldwide was now facing potential federal criminal charges for her role in enabling civil rights violations that culminated in the assault of a child. 4 weeks after the assault, the federal building conference room had become headquarters for what media was calling the most significant aviation civil rights case in American history. But the case was facing more sophisticated resistance than anyone had initially expected. U.S. Attorney David Martinez had taken personal charge of the prosecution, but Derek's legal defense was formidable. Defense attorney William Bradford, known for aggressive tactics in high-profile cases, had assembled a team of expert witnesses, character references, and legal precedents designed to create reasonable doubt. This isn't just about prosecuting Derek anymore, Martinez explained to Devon and Rivera during a strategy session. We're fighting a well-funded defense team with unlimited resources, corporate lawyers protecting Skyreach executives, and union representatives claiming Derek's civil rights are being violated by a rush to judgment. Devon's intelligence background helped him understand the legal battlefield dynamics. What about the other victims, the families who were silenced by corporate NDAs? Mixed results there, Martinez replied honestly. Some families are eager to cooperate now that Derek's pattern is fully exposed, but others are genuinely scared of retaliation, and some have been contacted by Skyreach's legal team warning them about potential NDA violations. Rivera consulted detailed notes from his ongoing battles with Skyreach's board of directors. What's our realistic timeline for trial? Derek's arraignment is next week, but his lawyers are filing extensive motions to suppress evidence claiming Emma Richardson's live-stream video violates his privacy rights and due process protections. They're also demanding change of venue, arguing he can't get fair treatment due to prejudicial media coverage. Agent Williams entered with significant but troubling updates about the investigation's scope. Derek's being held without bail, which his attorneys are appealing through federal court. But we've discovered something disturbing about systematic obstruction. Skyreach has hired the same crisis management firm that handled tobacco industry litigation, and they've been systematically contacting Derek's previous victims with enhanced financial settlements. Devon felt anger surge through his military-trained composure. They're trying to re-silence the victims with bigger payoffs. It gets worse. Some employees who've cooperated with our investigation are facing job-related retaliation, transferred to undesirable routes, or suspended pending internal review of their decision to provide testimony against Derek. Rivera's phone buzzed with yet another call from Skyreach's increasingly desperate board chairman. "Excuse me," he said, stepping away to take the call. "Alexander, the board is completely split on cooperation with the federal investigation. Some directors want full transparency and accountability, but others are fighting it through every legal channel available. They're claiming your shareholding position creates an insurmountable conflict of interest that could invalidate the entire investigation. Rivera's response was ice-cold and final. William, if the board thinks they can use my ownership stake to obstruct justice for the assault of a child, they're about to discover exactly how wrong they are. I have legal options they haven't even considered yet. When Rivera returned to the group, his expression had hardened into something resembling judicial steel. Gentlemen, this fight is going to be longer, more expensive, and more legally complex than we initially anticipated, but we have resources and authorities they can't match. Martinez leaned forward, recognizing the judge's tone. What kind of resources are we talking about? The kind that come from owning 12% of a company having federal judicial authority and possessing absolute determination that no child will ever again face what Jalen Brooks endured. Devon looked around the room at the faces of people committed to fighting for his son, despite systematic opposition. The obstacles were real and well-funded, but so was their determination. Agent Williams, what do you need from us to build the strongest possible case despite all this organized resistance? Williams smiled grimly, her FBI training evident in her strategic thinking. We need to be prepared for total legal warfare, because that's exactly what this has become. The federal courthouse in St. Louis had become the epicenter of national attention as United States versus Derek Hoffman and co-conspirators began on a frigid February morning that would be remembered as a watershed moment in aviation civil rights. 8 months after the assault, the case had evolved from individual criminal charges into a comprehensive indictment of institutional discrimination that threatened to reshape American corporate accountability. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of protesters held vigils for Jalen Brooks, while counter-protesters defended Derek's rights and condemned what they called reverse discrimination. Media trucks lined the streets for 6 blocks in every direction. Satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical sunflowers seeking justice. International news crews had arrived from Europe, Asia, and South America to cover what legal scholars were calling the most significant civil rights trial of the decade. Inside courtroom 4A, every seat was occupied by journalists, civil rights activists, family members of Derek's previous victims, corporate executives facing potential criminal charges, and aviation industry representatives monitoring potential precedent-setting decisions. Derek Hoffman sat at the defense table, looking gaunt and broken after 8 months in federal detention. Prison had systematically destroyed the confident authority figure who'd once terrorized airline passengers. His orange jumpsuit hung loose on his diminished frame, and his once aggressive posture had been replaced by the hunched shoulders of someone who'd learned to avoid eye contact with other inmates. Prison had been particularly brutal for Derek. As a child abuser, he occupied the lowest rung of the inmate hierarchy. He'd been attacked twice by other prisoners who'd seen news coverage of his assault on Jalen requiring protective custody that meant 22 hours daily in isolation. The confident authority he'd wielded over passengers had been replaced by constant fear and bitter resentment. His attorney, William Bradford, had spent the 8-month delay crafting an aggressive defense strategy, but Derek's deteriorating mental state complicated every legal maneuver. Prison psychologists had documented symptoms of depression, anxiety, and what appeared to be the early stages of paranoid thinking patterns. At the prosecution table, U.S. Attorney David Martinez organized evidence with military precision that reflected the case's historical significance. The 8-month delay had allowed investigators to build an overwhelming case that extended far beyond individual assault charges, but it had also given Derek's supporters time to organize and his defense team opportunities to challenge evidence and witness credibility. Judge Patricia Coleman entered at exactly 9 a.m., her reputation for fairness and zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics making her ideal for this high-profile case. At 63, she'd presided over several landmark civil rights cases and understood the historical significance of the proceedings about to unfold. In the gallery's front row, Devon Brooks sat beside his 11-year-old son Jalen, whose physical healing had been remarkable, but whose emotional growth was even more striking. The boy had grown taller and more serious during the 8 months since the assault. His childhood innocence replaced by mature understanding of injustice and the long fight for accountability that had reshaped his entire family's life. Judge Rivera occupied a seat directly behind them, his dual role as witness and Skyreach's largest shareholder, having created unprecedented legal dynamics throughout the pretrial process. Constitutional law scholars had debated his ethical position in legal journals, but his commitment to justice had never wavered despite months of legal challenges. Rosa Martinez sat under federal protection in the witness section, having faced 8 months of systematic harassment from airline employees who blamed her for betraying Derek. Her courage in testifying had cost her job, forced her family into hiding, and required federal marshals for protection, but she remained committed to seeing justice served. Emma Richardson, whose viral video had sparked the national conversation, sat in the media section with credentials from the documentary she was now producing about citizen journalism and social media accountability. Her follower count had grown to over 800,000, and she'd used her platform to highlight other cases of institutional discrimination and abuse of authority. Members of the jury, Martinez began with the gravity appropriate for a historic moment. 8 months ago, 10-year-old Jalen Brooks asked for apple juice on a commercial flight. For this simple, polite request, he was verbally abused, racially intimidated, and then brutally assaulted by flight attendant Derek Hoffman. Martinez moved to face Derek directly, who avoided eye contact entirely. But this case represents much more than one man's violence against a child. It's about a culture of institutional discrimination that Skyreach Airlines not only allowed but actively protected through financial settlements, systematic complaint burial, and corporate policies designed to silence victims rather than address civil rights violations. The prosecutor had 8 months of additional evidence to present to the jury. You will see that Derek's assault of Jalen wasn't an isolated incident, but the inevitable culmination of years of discriminatory behavior that was systematically enabled by corporate management. Derek Hoffman targeted minority passengers repeatedly over multiple years, and when they complained, Skyreach executives silenced them with money and legal threats, rather than addressing the criminal behavior. Martinez walked closer to the jury box, making eye contact with each member. We will show you internal corporate emails where executives explicitly discussed managing certain passenger demographics through enhanced settlement protocols. You will hear testimony from other victims who were paid to stay silent about Derek's abuse. You will see how a Fortune 500 company chose profit protection over passenger safety, enabling violence against the most vulnerable travelers. William Bradford's opening argument had evolved significantly during the 8-month delay, incorporating expert testimony about workplace stress, character witnesses from Derek's career, and legal precedents that might create reasonable doubt. Ladies and gentlemen, Bradford began with more confidence than his client's deteriorated state suggested. My client made a terrible mistake that he deeply regrets every single day. But Derek Hoffman has become a scapegoat for much larger problems in the airline industry that none of us want to acknowledge or address. Bradford gestured toward Derek with calculated sympathy. Derek was told by supervisors to maintain strict discipline to handle difficult passengers firmly and decisively. When communication with young Jalen became challenging and potentially threatening, Derek reacted as he'd been trained to react by 15 years of corporate messaging about crew authority and passenger management. The defense attorney had assembled expert witnesses who would testify about the psychological pressures of airline work, the effects of confined spaces on human behavior, and the legitimate challenges of maintaining order on commercial flights with increasingly entitled and aggressive passengers. My client's actions were wrong and tragic, Bradford continued, but they arose from institutional failures, inadequate training, and corporate negligence, not from criminal intent to violate anyone's civil rights. Derek Hoffman isn't the monster the prosecution wants you to believe. He's a victim of corporate policies that put employees in impossible situations without proper support or training. Bradford had also uncovered character witnesses among Derek's colleagues and passengers who'd had positive interactions with him over his 15-year career. The defense strategy was to humanize Derek while shifting blame to Skyreach's corporate culture and training failures. Judge Rivera's testimony remained the prosecution's cornerstone despite months of aggressive preparation by Bradford's defense team. The federal judge's credibility and detailed observations proved impossible to effectively challenge. Judge Rivera, Bradford pressed during extensive cross-examination, isn't it true that your reputation as a civil rights advocate creates a professional bias toward finding discrimination, even where reasonable people might see normal workplace conflicts or customer service interactions? Rivera's response demonstrated why he'd never lost credibility in over 2 decades on the federal bench. Mr. Bradford, I've presided over thousands of cases involving workplace disputes, customer service conflicts, and discrimination claims. I know the difference between miscommunication and deliberate criminal violence motivated by racial hatred. Derek Hoffman's assault of Jalen Brooks was unambiguously a federal crime. But you also own stock in Skyreach Airlines, don't you? Doesn't your financial interest in punishing the company create a conflict of interest that compromises your objectivity about what you claim to have witnessed? My financial interest is in ensuring Skyreach operates ethically and legally, protecting both shareholders and passengers. Derek's criminal behavior threatened both those interests and, more importantly, endangered innocent travelers who deserved protection rather than violence. Bradford tried multiple angles of attack. Judge Rivera, you've developed a personal relationship with the Brooks family during this investigation. Doesn't that emotional connection compromise your objectivity about the events you witnessed? Rivera's eyes flashed briefly with controlled anger. Mr. Bradford, watching a grown man assault a child would create an emotional response in any decent person. That doesn't change the facts of what occurred, make my testimony less accurate, or excuse criminal violence against a 10-year-old boy. Carlos Mendez's testimony about Skyreach's systematic cover-up culture remained devastating to the defense despite months of preparation by Bradford's team. The former HR coordinator had worked with prosecutors to organize evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of institutional discrimination. Mr. Mendez, Bradford pressed during cross-examination, isn't it true that you participated in covering up complaints for over 2 years before developing a conscience? Doesn't that make you equally culpable in whatever discrimination you now claim occurred? Carlos's response showed 8 months of preparation and genuine remorse. Mr. Bradford, I was scared of losing my job and didn't have the moral courage to speak up until I saw a child get brutally assaulted. I deeply regret my earlier silence, but that doesn't make Derek's violence acceptable or excuse the company's systematic policies that enabled his behavior. But you admit you were complicit in whatever cover-up you now condemn. Yes, I was complicit through my silence and participation. That's exactly why I'm testifying now, to make sure other people understand how these systems work and prevent future victims from suffering what Jalen Brooks endured. Rosa Martinez's testimony had grown stronger and more detailed during the delay, providing unprecedented insight into airline culture from someone who'd witnessed Derek's pattern of abuse firsthand. Derek wasn't unique in his attitudes. Rosa testified, her voice stronger than during FBI interviews. He was just the most obvious example of discriminatory attitudes that were common among certain crew members and tacitly accepted by management as effective passenger control. And Bradford's cross-examination was brutal and personal. Ms. Martinez, you worked alongside Derek for 2 years and said nothing about his alleged discriminatory behavior until after he was arrested. Doesn't that make you equally responsible for whatever you claim happened to other passengers? Rosa's response was emotional but powerful. Yes, I was complicit through my silence, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. I was scared of losing my job, worried about my mother's medical bills, and convinced myself that someone else would speak up. But watching Jalen Brooks get beaten for asking for juice made me realize that my silence was enabling violence against children. When Derek finally took the stand in his own defense after 8 months of federal detention, the psychological transformation was immediately apparent to everyone in the courtroom. Prison had stripped away every vestige of the confident authority figure who'd once terrorized airline passengers, leaving behind a broken, paranoid man who alternated between desperate self-pity and explosive rage. Bradford had spent months coaching Derek for this moment, but his client's mental state had deteriorated beyond effective preparation. The isolation, constant threats from other inmates, and gradual realization that his life was over had warped Derek's already fragile psychology. Derek, tell the jury about your 15-year career with Skyreach Airlines and your commitment to passenger safety. Bradford began with rehearsed gentleness. Derek sat rigidly in the witness chair, his voice mechanical and hollow. I served passengers professionally for 15 years with excellent performance reviews and high responsibility assignments, including supervising unaccompanied minors and special needs passengers. His answer sounded rehearsed and empty, lacking any genuine emotion or conviction. Prison had taught Derek what powerlessness felt like, and the confident authority he'd once projected was gone forever. Describe your state of mind on March 15th when you encountered Jalen Brooks. Derek's response revealed 8 months of psychological deterioration and institutional paranoia. I was stressed by equipment malfunctions, overbooked passengers, and increasing passenger entitlement and aggression. I was trying to maintain safety and order when this kid started getting confrontational and disrespectful with me. Martinez's cross-examination was systematically devastating. The prosecutor had studied Derek's psychological profile extensively and knew exactly how to trigger his underlying rage and paranoia. Mr. Hoffman, you testified that Jalen Brooks was confrontational. What specifically did this 10-year-old child do that seemed threatening to a grown man? Derek's answer revealed the prison paranoia that had consumed him. He had an attitude problem. Kids like that, they're taught to disrespect adults and challenge authority. They think they can push people around and get away with it. Martinez pressed harder, knowing Derek was close to breaking. Kids like what Mr. Hoffman. Derek's self-control began cracking exactly as it had 8 months earlier. Kids who think they're entitled to whatever they want. I've dealt with entitled passengers for 15 years. People who come on my plane thinking they can run their mouths and make demands like they own the place. The prosecutor played audio from Emma Richardson's live stream, letting Derek's own words from that day fill the courtroom. Jalen's polite voice asking for juice. Derek's escalating hostility, the final explosion of violence against a child. That sounds confrontational to you, Mr. Hoffman. Derek's prison-induced paranoia fully emerged in front of the jury. You people don't understand what it's like dealing with entitled, disrespectful passengers every single day. They think they can push crew members around, make demands, show no respect for authority. Martinez waited calmly for the outburst to subside. Mr. Hoffman, when you say, you people, who exactly are you referring to? Derek realized his mistake but couldn't control his deteriorating mental state. Passengers who think they're better than the people serving them. People who look down on working-class crew members trying to do their jobs. And in your experience, Mr. Hoffman, what do these entitled, disrespectful passengers typically look like? Derek's mask slipped completely, revealing the racial hatred that had motivated his years of abuse. It's not about what they look like. It's about attitude and respect. But isn't it true that 87% of the complaints against you came from minority passengers? Derek exploded with rage amplified by 8 months of prison isolation and resentment. Because they're always looking for something to complain about, they're taught to see discrimination everywhere, even when it's just normal customer service and discipline. The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs. Judge Coleman gavelled for order while Derek continued his self-destructive rant, revealing the deep-seated racial resentment that had motivated his systematic pattern of abuse. Bradford jumped up to object, but Derek couldn't stop talking. I've been dealing with ungrateful, entitled passengers for 15 years. That boy was disrespectful and needed to learn some manners. When order was finally restored, the damage to Derek's defense was complete and irreversible. He had revealed his true character in front of the jury, confirming every allegation about his racially motivated behavior and systematic abuse of minority passengers. The trial's most explosive and legally significant testimony came during the fourth week, when CEO Jonathan Pierce was called as a hostile witness. 8 months of federal investigation had uncovered the complete scope of corporate cover-ups, and Pierce looked like a man who'd aged decades under the pressure of criminal investigation. Pierce took the witness stand knowing that his testimony could result in personal criminal charges. His legal team had negotiated limited immunity in exchange for truthful testimony, but the scope of corporate misconduct made every answer potentially incriminating. Martinez displayed internal emails that had taken months of legal battles to obtain through federal court orders. Mr. Pierce, do you recognize this email chain between your legal department and human resources regarding what your company called passenger complaint management protocols? Pierce studied the documents with obvious reluctance, knowing millions were watching his testimony on live television. Yes, these appear to be internal communications about customer service procedures and legal risk management. Please read the email dated March 10, 2021 from your legal counsel to all regional managers. Pierce's voice was barely audible as he read words that would destroy his career. Subject: complaint demographics and legal risk assessment. Regional managers should be aware that passengers from certain demographic backgrounds are statistically more likely to file discrimination complaints and pursue expensive legal action. Enhanced settlement protocols should be applied to resolve these complaints quickly and confidentially to minimize legal exposure, negative media attention, and operational disruption. The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs and gasps of disbelief. Devon Brooks stared at Pierce with undisguised rage, while Jalen gripped his father's hand, finally understanding the scope of the system that had enabled his assault. Martinez continued methodically exposing email after email that revealed not just individual cover-ups, but systematic corporate policies designed to silence discrimination complaints through financial pressure, legal intimidation, and institutional gaslighting. Mr. Pierce, this internal memo specifically discusses pattern management for employees with high complaint rates from minority passengers. What did that corporate terminology mean in practical terms? Pierce looked trapped between criminal liability and public exposure. We tried to provide additional training and cultural sensitivity support for employees who were having communication difficulties with certain passenger demographics. By communication difficulties, you mean discriminatory behavior and civil rights violations. By communication difficulties, I mean situations where cultural differences or misunderstandings might lead to passenger dissatisfaction that could result in complaints or legal action. Martinez showed the jury settlement data that revealed the systematic nature of discrimination at Skyreach. Complaints from white passengers were typically resolved with apologies, service recovery gestures, and small compensatory measures. Complaints from minority passengers were met with larger financial settlements, but strict NDAs that prevented public disclosure and institutional accountability. Mr. Pierce, your company paid Derek Hoffman's victims over $75,000 in settlement money over 4 years, while simultaneously promoting him, giving him increased responsibility for unaccompanied minors, and recommending him for customer service awards. How do you explain that corporate decision-making? Pierce's admission revealed the corporate mindset that had systematically enabled Derek's violence. Derek was considered a valuable employee with consistently strong performance reviews from his direct supervisors. The complaint settlements were viewed as routine customer service expenses, not indicators of serious behavioral problems requiring disciplinary action. So paying tens of thousands of dollars to silence Derek's victims was more cost-effective than investigating his behavior and potentially terminating his employment. Pierce's devastating admission would be quoted in business schools for decades. From a purely financial cost-benefit analysis, yes, Derek's salary replacement training costs and potential recruitment expenses would have significantly exceeded the annual settlement expenditures. The jury selection process had taken 3 weeks, with potential jurors questioned extensively about their attitudes toward discrimination, corporate responsibility, and the use of social media evidence in criminal cases. Bradford had challenged potential jurors who'd seen Emma Richardson's viral video, while Martinez sought jurors who understood the broader implications of institutional discrimination. The final jury reflected America's diversity: 6 women, 6 men, representing various ethnic backgrounds, ages, and professional experiences. They included a retired teacher, a construction supervisor, an accountant, a nurse, a small business owner, and a college student, among others. After 6 weeks of emotionally intense testimony, the jury deliberated for 4 days, much longer than the prosecution had expected. The case's complexity, the institutional issues it raised, and Derek's own complicated psychology had made the decision more difficult than the clear-cut assault case it had initially appeared to be. During deliberation, jurors reviewed hundreds of pieces of evidence: Emma's viral video, corporate emails, witness testimony, expert reports, and Derek's own damaging admissions. They visited the crime scene, an identical aircraft setup, to understand the spatial dynamics of the assault. The jury foreman later revealed that their deliberations had been emotionally difficult, with some jurors initially struggling to separate Derek's individual crimes from broader questions about corporate responsibility and systematic discrimination. When the jury returned after 4 days of deliberation, their faces reflected the emotional toll of their decision-making process. Forewoman Margaret Peterson, a middle school teacher, looked emotionally drained from days of difficult discussions about justice, accountability, and institutional responsibility. On the charge of assault of a minor under federal jurisdiction, how do you find guilty? On the charge of violating civil rights through violence and intimidation, guilty. On the federal conspiracy charges involving corporate officials, guilty on some counts, not guilty on others. The mixed verdict reflected the jury's struggle with institutional versus individual responsibility. While Derek was clearly guilty of criminal assault, proving corporate conspiracy beyond reasonable doubt for all charges had been more challenging than prosecutors anticipated. Derek's legs buckled when the guilty verdicts were read. Bradford caught his collapsing client as the reality of decades in federal prison finally penetrated Derek's deteriorated mental state. Judge Coleman scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, noting that the hate crime enhancement, Derek's lack of remorse, and his systematic pattern of discriminatory behavior would likely result in the maximum possible sentence under federal guidelines. Mr. Hoffman, the jury has found you guilty of federal crimes motivated by racial hatred and systematic civil rights violations. The court will impose sentence after reviewing victim impact statements and considering the full scope of your pattern of discriminatory violence over multiple years. As Derek was led away in shackles, his hands cuffed behind his back, he turned toward the gallery where Jalen sat with his father. For a moment, their eyes met across the courtroom. Derek's face showed no remorse or acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused, only bitter resentment that his victims had refused to stay silent and accept abuse. Jalen, now 11 and stronger than any child should have to be looked directly back without flinching or looking away. The boy who had been terrorized 8 months earlier was now emotionally strong enough to face his attacker without fear or intimidation. 2 weeks later, the same courtroom was packed for Derek Hoffman's sentencing hearing, which would conclude the criminal phase of the case. Victim impact statements had been submitted by Jalen Brooks, his father Devon, and several of Derek's previous victims, who had finally found their voices after years of silence. Judge Coleman presided over the hearing, with the gravity appropriate for such a historically significant civil rights case. Mr. Hoffman, you have been convicted of serious federal crimes that not only harmed individual victims but undermined the safety and dignity of all airline passengers, particularly vulnerable travelers who deserved protection. Derek stood beside his attorney, wearing the same orange jumpsuit, looking even more gaunt and hollow than during the trial. 8 months of federal detention had left him physically and psychologically broken. Before I impose sentence, I want to address the broader implications of your crimes for American civil rights and aviation safety. You didn't just assault one child. You exploited a position of trust and authority to terrorize vulnerable passengers systematically over multiple years. Your actions were enabled by corporate policies that valued profits over passenger safety. Judge Coleman reviewed the evidence presented during trial, the systematic pattern of discriminatory behavior, the buried complaints, the financial settlements designed to silence victims, and the corporate culture that had protected Derek while endangering passengers. Your assault of Jalen Brooks was the inevitable culmination of years of unchecked hatred and institutional enablement. The sentence must reflect not just the specific crime, but your systematic pattern of civil rights violations and the institutional failures that protected your criminal behavior. Derek Hoffman, you are hereby sentenced to 12 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, followed by 5 years of supervised probation with restrictions on employment in transportation or customer service industries. You are permanently prohibited from working in any capacity that involves interaction with airline passengers or other vulnerable populations. The sentence was within federal guidelines, but on the higher end, reflecting the hate crime enhancement and Derek's complete lack of remorse throughout the legal proceedings. Derek showed no visible emotion as the sentence was imposed, his prison experience having taught him to suppress external reactions. His transformation from confident authority figure to broken federal prisoner was complete, but he had never acknowledged responsibility for the pain he'd caused or shown genuine remorse for his actions. As he was led away to begin 12 years in federal prison, Derek Hoffman disappeared from public view, becoming a case study in the consequences of institutional discrimination and individual hatred enabled by corporate indifference. The conviction represented a victory for Jalen Brooks and civil rights enforcement, but everyone involved understood it was just the first phase in a longer battle for aviation industry reform and cultural transformation. The morning after Derek Hoffman's sentencing, Skyreach Airlines confronted the most critical decision in the company's 60-year history. The boardroom atmosphere was toxic with conflict as directors engaged in heated arguments over the extent of reforms necessary to survive a crisis that had cost them over $8 billion in legal fees, settlements, lost revenue, stock devaluation, and ongoing federal oversight. Linda Rodriguez, chosen as permanent CEO after Pierce's resignation in disgrace, stood before a fractured board with a comprehensive reform proposal that would either save the company or complete its financial destruction. Her 44 years had included managing 3 major airline turnarounds, but none as complex as this cultural transformation while under federal investigation. Board members. Rodriguez began addressing the 12 executives seated around the crisis-darkened conference room. We face 2 stark choices. We can implement radical changes that demonstrate genuine commitment to passenger safety and civil rights, or we can watch Skyreach Airlines file for bankruptcy within 18 months. The resistance was immediate and fierce, reflecting deeper divisions about corporate responsibility and financial survival. Director Michael Torres, representing pension fund investors, spoke aggressively. "Linda, you're asking us to spend a fortune on feel-good programs while the company bleeds money from every wound. Stock price is down 52%. We're facing 347 federal lawsuits, employee morale is destroyed, and international routes are being canceled due to boycotts." Director Sarah Kim, backed by a major hedge fund, was equally confrontational. "These reforms could bankrupt us completely. We should focus on minimal compliance, quiet legal settlements, and rebuilding operational profitability. The public has a short attention span. They'll forget about this eventually." Rodriguez faced the resistance with financial projections that painted a grim picture of the company's future. "Michael, Sarah, I understand the financial pressures and fiduciary responsibilities, but we have ongoing federal investigations, congressional oversight, international boycotts organized by human rights groups, and continued media scrutiny that won't end until we demonstrate genuine change. Judge Rivera, participating via video conference in his role as largest shareholder, addressed the resistance with barely contained fury. "I've listened to 9 months of excuses, legal maneuvering, and resistance to basic accountability. Derek Hoffman's violence was enabled by institutional failures that some of you continue to defend even after his federal conviction." Torres shot back with increasing aggression. "Judge Rivera, with all due respect, your emotional investment in this case may be clouding your business judgment. We can't run a profitable airline based on social activism, personal vendettas, and expensive virtue signaling." Rivera's response was cold and final. "Mr. Torres, my emotional investment is in ensuring no child ever faces what Jalen Brooks endured. If that conflicts with your quarterly profit margins, I'll use every share I own and every legal avenue available to remove board members who prioritize money over human rights." The board's division reflected broader challenges in corporate America when institutional failures led to individual tragedies and demanded systematic change that threatened short-term profitability. Rodriguez continued with specific reform proposals, despite the fierce resistance from multiple board members. "First, we're establishing a zero-tolerance protocol with immediate termination for any discriminatory behavior. No warnings, no union protection, no appeals process, no second chances." Kim objected immediately with legal concerns. "That exposes us to massive wrongful termination lawsuits. Union contracts don't allow summary dismissal without extensive documentation and due process protections. We're renegotiating every union contract with passenger safety as the non-negotiable priority," Rodriguez replied firmly. "Unions that won't accept these terms can represent their members at other airlines." The second component faced equal resistance, hiring Devon Brooks as Director of Passenger Safety and Civil Rights Compliance with unprecedented authority. Torres was incredulous and personally insulted. "You want to hire the victim's father with no airline experience? That's pure emotional decision-making, not business strategy. The optics alone make us look like we're admitting systematic corporate guilt." Devon has the credibility, military expertise, investigative background, and moral authority to implement these changes effectively. His intelligence, experience, and personal understanding make him uniquely qualified to identify and eliminate discriminatory practices that our current leadership obviously failed to recognize or address. But internal resistance extended far beyond board meetings into the workforce itself. Anonymous employee surveys revealed deep divisions within Skyreach's 47,000 employees. While newer employees generally supported reforms veterans with decades of experience, resented being labeled as potential discriminators and questioned whether Derek's actions represented broader institutional problems. Flight attendant union representative Janet Walsh expressed widespread concerns during increasingly contentious contract negotiations. "These reforms assume all airline employees are racist until proven otherwise. Derek Hoffman was one disturbed individual, not representative of thousands of professional crew members who serve passengers respectfully and safely every day." Pilot Union President Mark Stevens was equally critical and threatened work actions. "Judge Rivera's continued involvement creates insurmountable conflicts of interest that could invalidate any negotiated reforms. How do we know these changes are necessary versus emotional overreactions driven by one tragic incident that's been blown completely out of proportion by media sensationalism?" Rodriguez realized that corporate transformation would require overcoming not just financial obstacles and board resistance, but cultural opposition from employees who felt unfairly blamed for Derek's individual crimes and media exploitation. The final vote was closer than anyone expected. 7 directors supported Rodriguez's comprehensive reforms. 5 opposed them completely. The narrow victory reflected divisions that would continue to complicate implementation for years and potentially trigger shareholder lawsuits challenging the board's decisions. Judge Rivera's federal task force had spent 9 months examining discrimination patterns across the aviation industry, but their comprehensive recommendations faced organized opposition from airlines, unions, and congressional members who viewed the proposals as government overreach that could damage American aviation competitiveness internationally. Transportation Secretary Maria Gonzalez strongly supported the Rivera Task Force recommendations, but implementation required congressional approval, industry cooperation, and regulatory enforcement that remained uncertain despite Derek's high-profile conviction and media attention. The task force has documented clear statistically significant patterns of discriminatory treatment across multiple major airlines. Rivera testified before a packed Senate Transportation Committee hearing covered by international media. Derek Hoffman's assault was extreme and criminal, but the underlying institutional attitudes that enabled his behavior are widespread throughout the industry. Senator Robert Hayes, representing states with major airline hubs and thousands of aviation jobs, questioned the scope and economic impact of proposed federal reforms. Judge Rivera, while Derek Hoffman's actions were clearly criminal and deserve punishment. Are we really prepared to assume entire industries are systematically discriminatory based on isolated incidents, even disturbing ones that receive extensive media coverage? Rivera's response was measured but firm, backed by comprehensive statistical analysis. Senator Hayes, our 9-month investigation reviewed over 95,000 customer complaints across major airlines over the past 7 years. The disparities in how complaints are handled, investigated, and resolved based on passenger demographics are statistically impossible to explain without acknowledging institutional discriminatory bias in complaint processing and resolution. The Passenger Civil Rights Protection Act, popularly known as Jalen's Law, faced organized, well-funded opposition from Airlines for America, the industry trade group, multiple employee unions, and business organizations who argued it would increase operational costs, create legal vulnerabilities for normal customer service decisions, and damage American aviation competitiveness. Airlines for America issued carefully crafted statements claiming, "While we absolutely support passenger rights and oppose discrimination in any form, this legislation could criminalize normal customer service interactions, create legal uncertainty that would harm aviation safety and operational efficiency, and impose compliance costs that would ultimately be passed on to consumers through higher ticket prices." But public support remained overwhelming after Derek's conviction and the systematic corporate failures exposed during the trial. Jalen Brooks, now 11 years old and speaking with remarkable poise developed through months of media training and therapy, testified before Congress with compelling personal authority that cut through industry lobbying efforts. "Senators," Jalen said, his voice clear and confident, despite the packed hearing room and live television coverage. "What Derek Hoffman did to me was wrong and painful, but I don't want to stay angry about it forever. I want other kids to fly safely without worrying that asking for juice might get them hurt by adults who are supposed to protect them. If this law protects them and prevents other families from going through what we experienced, then something good came from something terrible that happened to me." Jalen's testimony, broadcast live across social media platforms and carried by major networks worldwide, generated overwhelming public support that overcame industry lobbying. The bill passed both houses of Congress with strong bipartisan majorities and was signed into law by the President in a Rose Garden ceremony attended by Jalen, Devon, Judge Rivera, Rosa Martinez, and Emma Richardson. Implementation, however, would face ongoing challenges from airlines seeking to minimize compliance costs through legal challenges and unions protecting employee rights against what they viewed as discriminatory oversight that assumed guilt rather than innocence. The legal victories and policy changes provided public vindication and national recognition, but private healing for Jalen and Devon proved more complex and lengthy than media coverage suggested. Jalen had recovered physically from his injuries, but psychological impacts required ongoing therapy, family support, and careful navigation of public attention that continued to complicate his normal childhood development. Dr. Sarah Williams, who specialized in childhood trauma recovery, worked with Jalen twice weekly to address PTSD symptoms, anxiety around authority figures, sleep disturbances, and the unique challenges of being a public figure and civil rights symbol at 11 years old. Jalen shows remarkable resilience and emotional maturity. Dr. Williams explained to Devon during regular family therapy sessions. But he's dealing with hypervigilance, occasional nightmares, social anxiety, and the pressure of public expectations that are completely abnormal for child development. The media attention-seeking engagements and advocacy work have added complexity to his recovery that most child victims don't face. The crucial breakthrough in Jalen's healing came during a particularly difficult session where he expressed complicated feelings about Derek's 12-year prison sentence and the broader consequences of his decision to speak out publicly. "Dad, sometimes I think maybe Derek wouldn't be in prison for so long if I hadn't asked for that juice." Jalen said, his voice small and uncertain despite his public confidence. "Maybe his whole life wouldn't be ruined if I'd just been quiet like he wanted." Devon's response was immediate, firm, and loving. "Son, Derek Hoffman is in federal prison because he chose to attack you and other passengers over many years. You did absolutely nothing wrong at any point. You were polite, respectful, brave, and honest. Derek's consequences came from his choices about how to treat people, not from anything you said or did. But his whole life is completely ruined now," Jalen continued with the empathy that sometimes surprised adults. "Maybe if I'd just stayed quiet and not told everyone what happened." Dr. Williams intervened gently but firmly. "Jalen, feeling empathy for someone who hurt you shows your good heart and strong character. But Derek's consequences came from years of hurting many people, not just from hurting you. You're responsible for your choices, not his choices. Your courage in speaking up has protected other children from experiencing what you went through." This conversation marked a crucial turning point in Jalen's psychological recovery. He began to understand that justice and compassion could coexist, that holding Derek accountable didn't require hatred or revenge, and that healing didn't mean forgetting or minimizing the harm that had been done to him and others. Judge Rivera had become an unexpected father figure in Jalen's life, providing guidance about navigating public attention using personal experience to advocate for others without being consumed by the advocate role and understanding the broader implications of civil rights work. "Jalen reminds me every day why I became a federal judge," Rivera told Devon during one of their regular Sunday visits. "His courage in facing Derek in court, his willingness to testify before Congress, his refusal to let anger or bitterness consume him. He represents the very best of what our justice system can achieve when it works properly and protects the vulnerable." Devon's own healing process involved learning to balance protective father instincts with his son's growing independence advocacy role and normal developmental needs. The investigation and trial had revealed Devon's natural investigative talents and passion for institutional justice, leading to his successful career transition to corporate civil rights compliance work. "The hardest part," Devon confided to Rivera during one of their regular coffee meetings, "is accepting that I can't protect Jalen from every injustice or difficult situation he might face in the future. But seeing how he's used this experience to help other kids and families makes me incredibly proud of the young man he's becoming." The family's healing was strengthened by relationships built during their fight for justice. Rosa Martinez maintained regular contact, her own journey from fearful bystander to courageous whistleblower, providing ongoing inspiration for Jalen's continued development and advocacy work. "Rosa showed me that good people sometimes stay quiet because they're scared of losing their jobs or getting in trouble," Jalen told his father. "But she also showed me it's never too late to do the right thing, and that speaking up can help protect other people from getting hurt." Emma Richardson had become an unlikely family friend and mentor, her viral documentation of Derek's assault having evolved into ongoing advocacy for citizen journalism, social media responsibility, and technological accountability. Her documentary about the case had won several awards and sparked broader conversations about the role of technology in documenting injustice and institutional failures. But healing remained a daily process rather than a destination with a clear endpoint. Jalen still had occasional nightmares and anxiety attacks. Devon struggled with lingering anger toward the system that had endangered his son and enabled Derek's pattern of abuse. Both faced ongoing challenges from public attention media requests and the weight of being symbols in a larger civil rights movement that extended beyond their personal experience. Their healing was real, meaningful, and ongoing, but it required constant work, professional support, and understanding from family friends and professional counselors who recognized the unique challenges they faced as public figures in a historic civil rights case. The ribbon-cutting ceremony at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport drew thousands of spectators on a bright spring morning that felt like a celebration of both individual courage and institutional change. 12-year-old Jalen Brooks held oversized scissors as he prepared to officially open the Jalen Brooks Center for Safe Travel, the first comprehensive facility designed specifically for vulnerable passengers and a model being replicated internationally. The center represented 20 months of advocacy, federal legislation, legal battles, and construction. Its bright, welcoming spaces included comfortable seating areas designed by child psychologists, educational resources about passenger rights in multiple languages, trauma-informed staff training facilities, and dedicated safe spaces for children traveling alone, passengers with disabilities, and others requiring additional protection. This center exists because a brave young man refused to accept injustice and fought courageously for changes that would protect other children, said Transportation Secretary Maria Gonzalez, addressing the crowd of federal officials, state politicians, international delegations, media representatives, and families whose lives had been changed by Jalen's courage. Jalen Brooks transformed his pain into purpose, creating safer skies for every vulnerable traveler, not just in America, but around the world. Devon Brooks watched with overwhelming pride as his son prepared to cut the ribbon with confident determination that reflected his growth from victim to advocate. The frightened 10-year-old who had been brutally assaulted had grown into a poised young advocate who spoke publicly about civil rights with remarkable maturity while still maintaining the curiosity, humor, and innocence that made childhood precious and worth protecting. Judge Rivera, now chairing the Federal Aviation Civil Rights Commission, with international recognition, delivered the keynote address to the assembled crowd of over 3,000 people. The Brooks case exposed institutional failures that had been ignored for decades, but more importantly, it created momentum for industry-wide transformation that has made flying measurably safer for all passengers, especially those who need protection most. Rivera gestured toward the bustling center where children and adults of all backgrounds were already utilizing the safe spaces and support services that had become the international gold standard. These centers, now operating in 127 airports across North America and expanding internationally, ensure no child faces what Jalen endured. But they represent something deeper. A fundamental cultural shift from profiling passengers based on appearance to protecting them based on need. Linda Rodriguez, whose leadership had guided Skyreach through its painful but necessary transformation, despite ongoing financial challenges, announced the airline's latest initiative. Today, Skyreach is endowing a $25 million Passenger Dignity Scholarship Fund, providing college funding for young people committed to civil rights advocacy, social justice work, and institutional reform. The fund's first recipient was Jalen Brooks himself, who had decided to study law and civil rights advocacy with the ultimate goal of becoming a federal judge like his mentor. At 12, he was already planning how to use his future legal career to continue protecting others from discrimination, institutional abuse, and violations of human dignity. Rosa Martinez, now Skyreach's Vice President of Civil Rights Compliance and Employee Advocacy with recognition throughout the aviation industry, had developed training programs that were being adopted by airlines, hotels, and transportation companies worldwide. Her transformation from fearful bystander to corporate leader demonstrated the power of moral courage supported by institutional change and personal determination. Our cultural transformation has been complete and permanent, but it wasn't easy, cheap, or quick. Rosa told reporters with the honesty that had made her a respected voice in corporate reform. We lost employees who couldn't accept that passenger dignity was non-negotiable. We faced union opposition, financial pressures, lawsuits, and resistance from people who saw accountability as punishment rather than necessary improvement. But the results speak for themselves. Discrimination complaints have dropped 94%, while passenger satisfaction has reached historic highs across all demographic groups. While the world celebrated Jalen's achievements and institutional reforms, Derek Hoffman remained in federal prison serving his 12-year sentence in conditions that had grown increasingly harsh. The federal penitentiary in Colorado, where he was housed, maintained strict hierarchies, and child abusers occupied the lowest, most dangerous position. Derek spent 23 hours daily in protective isolation after being attacked multiple times by other inmates who'd seen news coverage of his assault on Jalen. The confident authority he'd once wielded over airline passengers had been completely replaced by constant fear, bitter resentment, and paranoid delusions about being targeted by a conspiracy. Prison psychologists documented Derek's complete lack of remorse or rehabilitation progress in monthly reports. He refused to participate in therapy, blamed his conviction on political correctness and reverse discrimination, and spent his isolation time writing angry letters he was never allowed to send. Occasionally, Derek watched news reports about the reforms his assault had inspired. The Jalen Brooks Center's federal legislation airline industry changes international recognition of his victims. His face showed only resentment and conspiracy thinking, never acknowledgement of harm caused or genuine remorse for his actions. In rare moments of self-reflection, usually late at night in his cell, Derek sometimes wondered if his life might have been different if someone had protected him as a child the way the world now protected Jalen. But those moments passed quickly, buried under layers of justification, blame, and delusional thinking that had hardened over decades of resentment. Derek would likely serve every day of his 12-year sentence, emerging as an elderly man into a world that had moved beyond the institutional hatred and discrimination he represented. 3 months later, Jalen Brooks boarded Flight 847, the same Seattle to Atlanta route where his journey toward justice had begun 21 months earlier. The symbolism was intentional. Jalen had specifically requested this flight for his return visit to his grandmother, wanting to complete the circle that had been violently interrupted and transform it into a symbol of healing and institutional change. Rosa Martinez had personally arranged to serve as Jalen's flight attendant, bringing their shared story full circle in a moment that felt both personal and historically significant. When she approached his seat with genuine warmth and the apple juice that had started everything, both understood the profound symbolism of the moment that had changed both their lives. "One apple juice for our most important passenger and my personal hero," Rosa said, her eyes reflecting the extraordinary journey they had traveled together from trauma and fear to healing, justice, and systematic reform. "Thank you, Rosa," Jalen replied, using her first name with the familiarity earned through shared struggle and mutual courage. "And thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth when it mattered most, even though it was scary and cost you your first job." Judge Rivera, traveling to the same civil rights conference that had originally taken him to Atlanta, watched their interaction from seat 1A with deep satisfaction and quiet pride. The alignment of their positions, Rivera witnessing both the original assault and now the healing Rosa serving with dignity, instead of standing by in fearful silence, and Jalen traveling confidently under protections created in his honor, represented the transformation possible when good people refuse to accept injustice and fight for institutional change. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Jalen pulled out a book about landmark Supreme Court civil rights cases and began reading about decisions that had expanded equality and justice throughout American history. His fellow passengers saw only a bright, curious student pursuing his education, unaware they were sitting near someone whose courage had already reshaped American aviation and inspired international reforms. But Rosa Martinez and Judge Rivera recognized something deeper. They saw a future lawyer, judge, or civil rights leader who would carry the lessons of Flight 847 forward into whatever battles for justice lay ahead, armed with personal experience, institutional knowledge, and the moral authority that came from surviving hatred and choosing courage over silence. When the flight landed smoothly in Atlanta, Jalen's grandmother, Clara, waited at the gate with tears of pride and overwhelming relief. The family reunion, interrupted by violence, was finally complete, made sweeter by everything they had overcome together, and all the lives that had been protected by their refusal to accept injustice silently. Derek Hoffman remained in federal prison, his hatred having inadvertently created platforms for healing and reform that would protect countless future travelers. Justice had been served comprehensively through criminal conviction, corporate transformation, legislative change, and international recognition. More importantly, hope had been institutionalized through laws, policies, cultural changes, and physical infrastructure that would protect future generations from the discrimination and violence that had nearly destroyed one child's faith in adult protection and institutional fairness. The boy who had been brutally assaulted for politely asking for apple juice had transformed American aviation, forever inspired international reforms, and proved that even the youngest voices possess the power to demand justice and create lasting change when supported by adults willing to fight for what's right and institutions capable of growth, accountability, and meaningful transformation. In a small frame on Jalen's bedroom wall hangs his boarding pass from Flight 847. Not as a reminder of trauma, but as proof that one voice, no matter how young or seemingly powerless, can change the world when it refuses to be silenced by hatred, intimidated by authority, or discouraged by those who profit from injustice. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video with others who might be inspired by Jalen's courage. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful stories of justice and transformation to light. Remember that each of us has the power to stand up against discrimination when we witness it. Sometimes all it takes is one person documenting the truth to create real change. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.